So it's recording. So now that we are recording, thanks everybody for making the time tonight to come along. I just wanted to, my name's Jenny Fitzharding, and I'm a member of the NEA BPD Steering Committee here in Australia, and I'm joined by my fellow steering committee members, Terry Lee Hill and Liz Hodgman, who are going to help with answering questions, and our coordinators Kylie Hayes and Mary Cantrell will also be answering questions. And I'd of course like to acknowledge Dr. Perry Hoffman, who is the president of the National Education Alliance for Borderline Personality Disorder in the USA, and she is a board member of NEA BPD in Australia. And I'm going to unmute Lucy now, because I'd like to introduce Dr. Luciana Payne. Just say hello so people
hello.
Come up. So how Zoom works is the active speaker view is how it works. If you want to change the way that you're viewing things, you can, there are some options up on the top right hand corner of the screen where you can swap shared screen with the video, or you can see both. You can go to full screen. For your own bandwidth, you might choose to turn your video off. Am I still here? Because it's just gone on me. Okay.
You're there.
Good. Excellent. I just lost my screen then, which was, I shouldn't talk and do. So, and in fact, I am going to lose my screen because I need to pull up another one. Of course it wants to update it in the middle of a webinar. Fantastic. So Dr. Luciana Payne is a clinical psychologist who specialises in working with parents, couples and families. Lucy's a member of the board of directors of NEA BPD in the States, and is a trainer for Family Connections, a program for family members of individuals with borderline personality disorder. Some of you tonight may have already participated in or are looking forward to participating in a Family Connections group. Lucy's also led dozens of Family Connections groups, so she really understands the carers' role in helping people to recover from BPD. And she provides skill coaching for parents and families impacted by the suicidality and emotional dysregulation of their loved one. Dr. Payne is a staff psychologist at McLean Hospital, where she works in both research and clinical practice. And tonight we're going to be hearing about the results of that research into the impact of suicidality on families. So I'm going to hand it over to Lucy now.
All right. Thank you, Jenny. Well, good night, everybody. You will see the sun starting to shine behind me over here all the way in the United States, so it will get brighter and brighter as I speak. But I'm so glad that we are having a chance to talk about this with family members down there, and thank you guys for joining us. What I will be speaking about tonight I want to do a little bit of an overview of what happens for families when a loved one engages in a suicide attempt or significant suicidal or self-injurious behavior. I don't think we talk enough about that, and families can find themselves really lost and not sure what to what to expect. And with that, we'll talk a little bit about some of what we are finding through our research on these families. And then if we have enough time, I will talk a little bit about some of the skills, some things that can actually help you get through these difficulties that you're going through. And as you can see there on my screen, I just want to acknowledge my colleagues, Dr. Ellen Frizetti and Cynthia Kaplan, who are also participating in this research and this effort. Okay, let me see if that will go through here. How do I change my slide? There we go. So let's talk a little bit about the scope of the problem. So I was looking, of course, I know all the stats about suicide and suicidal ideation in the United States, but I wanted to see what this was like in Australia. And here's what I found. in 2017, which is the most recent published data for Australia, there were over 3,000 completed suicides. And there's an estimate, and this is an estimate sort of worldwide, that for every suicide attempt, there's approximately 23, for every completed suicide, there's approximately 23 to 30 suicide attempts. So as you can imagine, there are, obviously the families of people who complete suicide are significantly impacted. But we have many, many, many more families who are impacted by suicidal ideation and suicide attempts. So if you do the math, this would result in approximately 90,000 suicide attempts each year in Australia alone. And then if we keep, doing the math for 2 parents for each one of these 90,000 people, that leads us to almost 200,000 parents, and then thousands and thousands of siblings, grandparents, loved ones, family, friends, everybody else that is involved in their lives. And these people are, of course, terrified. They are confused and they don't really know what to do. So just a little bit more of information here. I was also kind of interested and slightly shocked to find out that these numbers are very similar in the US too, by the way. Considering all causes of death, suicide accounted for, and you can see there, 1.2% of deaths of children younger than 15. And I think that the most shocking numbers are that one for 15 and 19, and slightly lower for 20 to 14. But this is 1/3. 1/3 of deaths in this age group is accounted by suicide. So this is a huge problem. It's certainly a serious health concern. And of course, when we talk about the prevalence of non-suicidal self-injury, this would be, cutting or engaging in some behavior that causes harm to self without the intent of suicide. The numbers, I didn't find any numbers specific for Australia, but this is the numbers that we have here in the US, and similar numbers were found in different countries. 15 to 30% of young adults, adolescents and young adults will engage in some kind of non-suicidal self-injury. And of course, we know that for most people, especially chronically suicidal teens, but adults as well, they have multiple problems. They're not just dealing with suicidal ideation, but they're dealing with multiple problems. So when you think about what these families are going through, they're managing things that, most people don't know how to manage. So there are 2 things that I want families to take away from just this little bit of information. Is that one is that you're not alone. So if you think about just these numbers, there are so many people out there that are struggling with these types of problems. And then the second thing is that these problems are serious. They are rarely things that, families are able to just manage on their own or know what to do when they happen. And despite knowing this, I think that, definitely the help available for families is not where we would want it to be. So I want to talk a little bit about what happens for families. So one of the other things that happens with suicidal ideation is that, and suicide attempts, is that it often, and this doesn't mean every time, right? But often people who engage in one suicide attempt will often engage in another. So the average number of suicide attempts is 3. So what that means is that, of course, if you have a loved one who engaged in one suicide attempt, that doesn't necessarily mean that there's 2 more coming. But, of course, there are people who engage in many suicide attempts over their lifetime, and other people who, engage in one, and they get their help, or they get support, and things change, and they move on. But I think the point is that often for many families, this is not a problem that goes away quickly. And so families can find themselves in a thing that we call empathic despair. So it's this, the sense of pain and suffering that you share in seeing someone you care about suffering. So you feel for them and you feel for you. There's a lot of grief. There's a lot of pain involved for everybody. There's also a lot of confusion about roles. So family members are put into situations where they're not really trained and it's not their natural role. So parents and siblings often become caregivers and safety monitors, right? Like, so, watching their loved one to make sure that they're going to be okay. And we often hear of parents sleeping next to their loved ones or worrying about them and, becoming case managers, trying to figure out doctor's appointments and those kinds of things. And so this is really difficult for families to cope with. We have, siblings sometimes who are actively involved in these kinds of things and, are not sure how to place themselves into this relationship that's now changed. There's also social isolation, and I think that goes with the point that's a little bit further down the slide with stigma. There is not a lot of talk about this. This is not the kind of thing that you typically go to work and you share with all of your coworkers why you were unable to come to work for the last 2 or 3 days because a loved one had a suicide attempt. This is something that families don't share widely. And that results to a sense of feeling isolated and not having enough help. Now, of course, there's a lot of grief and distress. Many families find themselves feeling depressed, burned out with managing, so many different things, and burned out with the relationship. Disempowered. This is something that people don't really know how to manage, and there's no, you get, as a parent and in our social, media and on TV, we get all of these models about how to manage so many different things and all these tips about how to manage different family and life situations. But somehow this all too common mental health crisis, suicide, self-injury doesn't often make it up there. And then the one that I want to talk most tonight is this last point on this slide here, is that the family members are terrified. It is very scary to have someone you care about engage in a suicide attempt. So let me talk a little bit about what that means. So we did let me toggle back here so you don't see just a blue screen. Perry Hoffman, who's here on our call tonight, along with a couple other researchers here, did a study on family members of who were sort of coming through our NEA BPD website and asked them about their experiences with suicide and how they felt. And what they found is that most people who responded to the study, they had experienced a suicide attempt that they found traumatizing, that met criteria for what we would call a traumatic event. And then about half of them met diagnostic criteria for PTSD, with the suicide attempt being the trauma. And so this is often, first of all, this was, it's one of those things that it's shocking and it's not shocking. Of course, it makes perfect sense that family members would be traumatized and that they would be significantly impacted by these kinds of things. And at the same time, I don't think this is something that most people know what to do with, or that people had thought about the experience of families as being a PTSD and trauma. So let me walk through how that happens for families. And I don't know, I think somebody with their screen scratched over there, but that's okay. So let's start with witnessing somebody that you care about engage in a suicide attempt or self-injurious behavior. Of course, those things are they're they're scary, they're dangerous. And so the typical response is that distress increases, right? So everybody going through this will have a period of time where they feel very distressed. But then there's something that we call emotion processing. That means you talk about what happened with other people. You get some support. You have a chance to think about it for yourself and sort of walk through in your own time the events that happen and somehow make sense of it. So, you can think about it as digesting what happened. And when that happens, when there's emotion processing, then, the stress decreases. And people are able to move on with life. However, when people are not able to emotionally process, and this happens often for families, because as you are going through and navigating this emergency situation, the focus is rarely on how I'm feeling about this and, what is this experience like for me. Families do something that is completely understandable, which is turn all of their attention to their loved one and to navigating the crisis and, questions and appointments and all those kinds of things, and then starts the monitoring of safety and all of that. And so they are unable to really process what happened. And that's when we have a trauma response. So a trauma response involves, having thoughts and images pop up into your mind, trauma-related emotions and beliefs. So thinking that, the danger is still present, or having a lot of negative beliefs about the future of your loved one or your family, or how things are going to go. But we also start to avoid things, right? So family members, they start to avoid talking about it, going into places that remind them of those situations, or are participating in the same discussions that led into, a conflict in the past. So there's a lot of backpedaling and sort of avoidance that starts happening. And one key characteristic with a trauma response too is this hypervigilance and hypoarousal. So people are just sort of on alert and on edge. And of course, oh, what happened there? Let me go back. Here we go. And of course, having a previous traumatic experience in your own life, at some point in your life, if there was some other kind of trauma that you've experienced, or if there are multiple suicide attempts, then it makes it much more likely that someone is going to respond with a trauma response, as opposed to being able to successfully emotionally process. So, of course, we're talking about families, and so this process is happening for multiple people. And I just want to very quickly walk through here. So we have, relative 1 and relative 2 who may have an immediate trauma and stress responses as natural. And then they go on to emotionally process and decrease the distress, but also may go on to develop PTSD. And of course, if you can imagine, maybe relative 1 is mom, and mom goes on to develop, a trauma response, and a sibling or dad or grandparent goes on to be able to emotionally process. What happens is that then one person's trauma response starts to impact the other people in the family, right? So as I'm terrified and I don't want to leave my loved one alone, then now I'm engaging in conflict and we disagree, and my fear is impacting other people who now may become afraid or may not understand why I'm feeling so terrified. And of course, my own difficulties, if I'm struggling with PTSD or trauma-related problems, that of course impacts the family member too, who might now be looking to go back into their life, or really feeling like, okay, no, I can be by myself, I can do these things, but the family member is terrified because sometimes they can, sometimes they can't. And so we can imagine how complicated this picture can get with multiple people being involved. So let's think a little bit about, what this can look like for families. So, we talk a lot about being able to share your experience and being able to understand other people's experience. So I think the first piece that is important for families to do, and I encourage everybody who's watching to sort of ask yourself these questions and then check in with your other family members. If you've gone down to emotionally process and really had a chance to think about and talk about what's happened, or if you're still struggling with it, if you find that it's been, several weeks or longer since the suicide attempt or the self-injurious behavior, and you still have a very real sense of danger, and if it's scary to you to leave that person alone, or if you worry about a lot of the time worrying about what they're doing and waking up in the middle of the night or having nightmares or things like this, then you might be experiencing what we call a trauma response. And of course, the way through that, as you may imagine, is to emotionally process, right? Is to figure out a way to talk about it, to get some help. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later in the hour. But let me walk through some things that you can do to reduce this impact of cumulative trauma. We have this one skill that we call restart. So the R stands for reducing self-invalidation and judgment. So I'll talk a little bit more about this in a couple of slides ahead, but what tends to happen is that people, I think both as a function of paying so much attention to their loved one, but also because, you're unsure how things happened, family members tend to really be very critical and self-invalidating and have a lot of judgments about themselves. So that might look like, I should have done more, or I should be doing more now, or I shouldn't have said that. If you have any shoulds in your head or any self-criticism about how you reacted to something or about how you're talking to your loved one, or judgments about yourself, then that would be what we're calling self-invalidation. So I'll talk a little bit more about how to reduce self-invalidation. But I think the first step is just to really acknowledge this is really difficult. This is extremely challenging. And so, of course, you may not know how to manage this. Of course, you might say something that, later on you're like, oh, maybe that wasn't so helpful. It is just really difficult to know. So, reducing self-invalidation might start with saying, wow, this is really difficult, or I'm really having a hard time. Or, maybe as a result of learning about this, you can say, wow, I think I might have a trauma response, or I think I might be stuck and not have emotionally processed. That process is what we would call self-validation. The second one, what happened there? Okay, let me go ahead and put them all here because they were out of order. So engaging in self-care. I know this is really hard to do, especially when you're managing so many different things. Thinking about yourself is a hard thing to do. And I know families sometimes get really invalidated when, they go and people tell them like, oh, you've just got to take care of yourself, or you got to do this. But it is certainly very important to engage in self-care so that you can continue to navigate through these things, and so that you don't, you don't start running on empty. And part of self-care might be to, sort of attending this kind of talk, hopefully is a little bit of your self-care and getting some understanding on what happened, but also taking some time to pay attention to what you might need in order to keep going. So getting some help, resting when you can, going to your own doctor's appointments, those kinds of things can be extremely important. The S it stands for seeking social support. And so, as you know, you're not alone. I know it feels really lonely, but you're really not alone. And there are other families out there that are struggling with it. We'll hopefully talk a little bit more about how you may find some help, or how to connect with other family members, but really maybe starting in your own circle. So finding one person who you think you can talk to about this and be really open about it might be sufficient to start your own process of emotion processing. And then, of course, talking about your experience, especially grief, especially how difficult this is. You know, if you find that one person, or if you're lucky enough to have a group a group of people that you can talk about this, talking is really one of the best ways for you to begin to make sense of what happened, to get feedback. It allows other people to provide support and validation. When you don't talk about your experience, it's really hard for other people to know what you might need, or what is going on, and just the depths of these difficulties. Avoid avoiding. So this is some of the things that really start to happen as a result of a trauma response, is that now family members will avoid, you know, all kinds of things that might have been related to the suicide attempt or the self-injury, topics of conversation, or places in the house. Or sometimes, you know, this happened often, if there's a suicide attempt or self-injury when you're out of the house. And then all of a sudden you're like, oh, I can't be out of the house, I have to be here. Or if your loved one engaged in self-injury when they're in the bathroom, then you're like, oh, I have to be there. So, or I can't go anywhere when they're doing that. So avoid the avoidance and start doing some of these more normative things that you used to do, say, you know, before this happened, and safely start to get there. And we'll talk about this other point here a little bit more. Re-engage in life. So going back into some of the things that you used to do before. I know this is really difficult to do, but as much as you can, participate in some of these normative things that you did before, even if it's for a little bit of your day, will be really important. And then starting to think about the difference between danger now and danger in the past. So what happens with a trauma response is that the situation in the past was certainly dangerous, right? So a suicide attempt, self-injury is dangerous, but it was dangerous when it happened. And so what happens with a trauma response is that then the brain encodes that situation as dangerous, and everything else about it. So maybe where you were, the words that were said, the topic of conversation, the smells in the room, or whatever was happening in that moment, your brain really encodes that as potentially dangerous. And so when you go back into parts of that situation, then your brain is automatically going to say, whoa, that's really dangerous. That's exactly what happened before. This is not different than, you know, somebody who might be in a car accident, for example, and then, you know, the next day or for the next week, really don't want to get back into the car because now the car is associated with a really dangerous situation. And so we have to be really active in helping your brain assess right now, this moment, whether it's dangerous or maybe if it's potentially safe, right? So a car, the day after an accident, assuming, you know, the car is fine to drive, or if it's a different car, is actually no more dangerous than any time in the past. It is just as dangerous. You are not more likely to get in a car accident now than you were yesterday before you got into that car accident. But of course, our brain is going to tell us, this is dangerous. This is really dangerous. And so being able to look at right now and say, okay, is this dangerous right now, or is this safe right now? And if it's safe right now, then proceed as if it's safe. Because I think what happens is that people fail to notice that things are safe, and then they proceed as if things are still dangerous. And that's why some of this avoidance and, you know, fear and worry start to happen. Okay, I don't know how we're doing. I don't know if there are any questions that I should go into now. I know Jenny and others were going to check in on chats, but
Lucy, can I perhaps ask, there's two things that are coming up for me around PTSD. So in layman's terms, just for the benefit of people of a non-clinical background, you know, would you say that PTSD is when you're stuck in a past experience that is changing the way you're experiencing the present?
Absolutely. And so PTSD is really all about responding right now in the same way as if the traumatic experience happened in the past. So, you know, we see this with people who have gone through all kinds of traumatic experiences, from car accidents to, you know, assaults or other, you know, like a house fire or other scary experiences. Certainly here in the U.S., we have a lot of our servicemen in the military with combat-related PTSD. And so what happens is that then your brain, as I was saying, it encodes the situation from the trauma as a dangerous situation. And it really has a hard time telling that that event is not happening right now. And this is, of course, becomes really difficult if the traumatic experience was chronic, so it was happening over and over and over. Then it becomes really hard to tell that it's not happening now. So then people start reacting to day-to-day situations as if that's happening, and they start to create their lives to avoid that potentially dangerous situation happening again. So I think for family members, that might look like being scared of, you know, leaving their loved ones alone, even if, you know, in that moment they might be just watching TV. They might be sitting on the couch and watching TV, but let's say the day where they had a suicide attempt, they were also sitting on the couch and watching TV, and you didn't see it coming. It's really hard to know, are they safe now, or is this just like the last time? And so what happens in PTSD is that you assume it must be just like the last time, and so I'm going to react as if it's a dangerous situation. And then you might sit next to your loved one on the TV and, you know, and not allow them to be alone. Of course, if they're safe and they're not suicidal, then that can start a really big conflict, like, leave me alone. What the heck are you doing? But for the person with a trauma response, this is life and death situation, potentially, right? And so this is sort of being able to tell the differences. Are they safe now? Somebody sitting and watching TV is safe right at this moment. Like right now they are.
So how important would you say it is for people, A, to seek help for themselves, you know, like separate from their loved one's help, because
Yes.
sometimes there can be, you know, the stigmatizing that you've identified earlier, and B, to seek that help from someone who's trauma informed, who understands how trauma works on people's experiences?
I think they are both really important. So certainly finding help for yourself. This is, you know, as you can see, many of these letters in our acronym Restart Here is about, you know, finding some time for you. You are the one who need to really be able to emotionally process what happened. And sometimes people are able to do this by talking to a good friend or by talking to somebody else in the family. But if this is not happening, if you don't have that kind of support, or if this is really difficult to get through it, and you, even though you're talking about it, it doesn't seem to be changing, then seeking professional help and getting somebody who is trauma informed and they know how to manage a trauma response is going to be extremely important. And I'd say that, you know, even going beyond seeking somebody who's trauma informed, but you know, when psychologists and therapists are going through their training, I don't think anybody's ever talked about, like, oh, and by the way, you might have a family member who has PTSD because of a suicide attempt. This is not necessarily on their radar. And in fact, when we were recruiting for our study here of traumatized family members, you know, we sent out a flyer and an email to a number of clinics and clinicians and said, hey, we're looking for family members who may have PTSD. And, it was almost like everybody was kind of scratching their heads, because I don't think people tend to think about it in that way. And then we went back and said, that family member who's really struggling and have a hard time, they're worrying all the time, and they have a hard time allowing their loved one to be alone. And, we sort of went on to describe, and then everybody's like, oh, yeah, we know that person.
And instead of recognizing their reactivity as being a trauma response, they make a judgment about it, saying it's a personality response.
Right, exactly.
Like reactive like that, and creating, whereas in fact, they're behaving as somebody who is traumatized.
That's absolutely right. And so I think, talking about this even with somebody who's trauma informed, and say, I'm having these kinds of difficulties, and I need to make sense of what happened, will be really important. And hopefully, as hopefully we have some professionals in our here attending too, and the more we talk about this, the more everybody becomes aware that this is really an area that, unfortunately, families have been underserved. And we, understandably, a lot of the effort and the support and the resources goes to the person who is struggling with suicidality. Of course that does. But we have at least twice family members, twice the number of family members, and often many, many more, right, who are struggling as their loved one is going through this. So it's important that family members know that this is a normative, being scared and worried is a normative response. But if this is really if it keeps going and it starts to become difficult to live your own life, and you're terrified all the time, and it's creating even more conflict, then seeking help will certainly be important.
And I guess there's, how important is it to not give up, but to, bearing in mind that there's so many myths around BPD, around when you can diagnose, and the nature of how somebody develops BPD, and there's a lot of old stories that are still being told. I guess what we try to encourage people to do is to keep seeking people that are mental health professionals who are informed and who are understand the incredibly important role carers play in their loved ones' recovery.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that one thing that happens too is, people really don't think that it's appropriate to take time to look into their own suffering, because, their loved one is suffering so much more. And, and of course, without taking care of yourself, it's impossible to be able to really effectively help your loved one navigate through all of these things that are happening. So it's common for family members to really judge their own experience, and especially because oftentimes when you go into the emergency room after a suicide attempt, or you engage with professionals, there is often blame that goes around, and the person is feeling better by the time they get through the ER, and they are sent home, and you really don't. You're scared because they weren't fine when they were home, but they're fine now, and you're like, am I just supposed to take them home, and what do I do with them? There's certainly not enough support for families as they go through it. All right.
Let's get back to it.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about getting back to it. Let's talk about getting back into life when fear takes over. So we have this skill called opposite action. So every emotion that we have, it comes with an urge to engage in some kind of action, right? And when we are scared, when we have fear, the urge is it's to seek safety, right? And so to sort of like back away from the dangerous situation. So opposite action is really all about when the urge and the emotion does not fit the facts of the situation. So again, you go back and your loved one is sitting and watching TV. There's nothing inherently dangerous about someone sitting and watching TV. Your brain might say, whoa, alert, alert, alert. This is exactly what happened, 3 weeks ago or 2 months ago. I just can't tell. So noticing like they're sitting and watching TV, they're actually right here in front of me and they're perfectly safe right now in this moment. I don't know what will happen in 10 minutes, but right now they're perfectly safe. They're just watching TV. And so if the urge is to then try to make this situation safe, right, avoid the danger, and let's say, for example, you really had to go to the grocery store, but you're, worried about it. You're worried that if you go, they're going to be alone and they might engage in, a suicidal behavior. So your urge is then to stick around, right? To not go anywhere, not leave the house. So opposite action would be doing the exact opposite to your urge. So what happens when we have an emotion is that emotion, it feeds into action, but action also loops back and feeds into our emotions. So the more we engage in behaviors, in things that we want to do as a response to our emotion, the more we feel that emotion. So we sort of get stuck into that loop of emotion, we do an action, the action feeds back into the emotion. And so we just kind of, go along with that flow. So opposite action would really be a way to break that cycle when the action does not fit the fact, when the emotion doesn't fit the facts and the action would not be helpful. So then what we would do is engage in the exact opposite action to what we want to do. So if our urge is to avoid, to not go out of the house and to stay put next to our loved one and just sit right next to them and keep eyes on. So opposite action would be go, right? Like leave, maybe go to, around the block for a walk to start. You don't have to start with leaving for the whole weekend and taking a vacation. You don't have to start big, but you can start small. For some people, it might actually be, go into the other side of the house and not have eyes on your loved one for, a few minutes and notice that's safe. Notice that as you do that, everything is okay. So that allows your brain to then, two things. One, another emotion then will happen, right? So that you can notice that things are safe and relearn so that you're no longer pairing your loved one watching TV with an exclusively dangerous situation. And now it actually can be safe too. So opposite action is a really important thing for family members to be doing. And I encourage you, when you're noticing an emotion, noticing something that you want to do, if it's not going to be helpful or if it's causing problems, if it's leading to more distress or conflict, maybe take a look. Like, can I look around and see, is this safe? Is this helping? And if not, then engage in an action that is complete opposite to what your emotion's telling. I don't want to minimize how difficult this is. This is incredibly a difficult thing to do. And so this is part of, as Jenny's saying, it's extremely helpful for family members if you're finding that you just can't tell if it's safe or if it's not safe, or that it's too difficult to do opposite action. Then certainly look for help. Ask for another, person, a support person, whether they be a friend or another family member, to help you tell the difference and think about what opposite action could look like for you. Or certainly look for a professional who may be able to help you come up with a plan on how to start doing opposite to your emotion actions that might lead you in a different path. And then the last thing that I want to talk about tonight is self-validation, because your needs, your emotions, your experiences, they matter too. So just a few things here on how to self-validate, how to look into your own experience and say, yes, of course, right? So the first step is, of course, to identify any self-invalidation. Anytime you have a should, anytime you have, a judgment about, I'm a bad family member or a mom, dad, or this isn't my fault. What did I do wrong? Notice that chatter in your head. And I want you to just ignore the content. Like, let's just ignore the meaning of the words that are being said. And instead focus your attention on just describing what happened. Like, what is the situation? What are the facts that happened right before I started having those judgments in my head? So it might be that, it might be that somebody said that it is your fault, or that, asked you, like, why couldn't you bring them in earlier, or something like that. Or it might be that your loved one said something really hurtful to you. So putting words into that experience, it might be like exactly just describing my loved one, somebody that I care about, said something that was hurtful, or called me a name, or, told me to leave them alone. And then you're going to describe your reaction to what just happened. I think it's especially important to look for things like disappointment, sadness, fear. Often anger, guilt, shame tend to take over. And those are typically response to the self-invalidation and to the sort of the content of those judgments. So if you're feeling those things, keep looking. Ask yourself, would disappointment make sense here? Would sadness make sense? And then connect your reaction to what happened. In what way does sadness and disappointment make sense when somebody that you care about yells at you? In what way does that make sense, right? And then you can say this clearly, like, it makes perfect sense that I'm hurt, right? My loved one yelled at me. It makes perfect sense that I'm feeling this way. It makes perfect sense that I'm scared, or that I'm sad. So stating that clearly and loudly to yourself, or in your head if you have to, loudly in your head even, so that you are able to then recognize that these reactions make perfect sense. And of course, the last thing I want to say about this is that looking for help and talking about it, talking about your experiences, talking about what happened. So being able to tell a professional or a support person, yeah, I'm struggling. This is difficult. I don't know what to do. This is really sad. This is really scary. That is self-validation too, right? Without expressing your experience, of course, in order to express it, you need to acknowledge it first. So that's the first step, is to say, this is happening for me. And then the second step would then be to tell somebody about it. And talking about your experience is a very important way of self-validation, because it allows others around you to really give you the support that you might need. Without talking about it, it's really hard for people to know. So when your neighbor asks you how things are going and you say, oh, everything's great, right? Everything is fine. I understand that there's so much involved in, telling them, all of what is going on. But hopefully you're able to share that with some person, because if everybody else thinks that everything is fine, and, in your private life, inside your home, things are not fine, then it'll be really hard for you to get the support that you need and deserve, and that it would be important to help you get through these difficult things. So I'm going to end here and allow some more time for us to talk about whatever isn't clear or answer any questions. And I know Terry Lee was going to tell us a little bit too about where families might find some support over there locally in Australia.
Hi. Okay, so we've got one question, which I think is very relevant to everyone. Stephen was asking, you know, most people are naturally going to be very fearful after a suicide attempt. You know, when is it considered to be PTSD, which needs treatment or needing treatment?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. So I'm going to go back here on our slide so that I can, it'll be, you have a visual. So if you look on that bottom box, the one that says intrusions, emotions, beliefs, avoidance, those are the 4 categories of something that would need to be present for us to think about PTSD. So you would have to be experiencing significant intrusions, meaning thoughts or memories or images about what happened, about the traumatic experience coming to your mind when you really don't want it to, or nightmares happening frequently. Also, negative emotions and negative beliefs about the traumatic experience. So again, things like, you know, the world is not safe, or my family is no longer safe. You know, having a lot of negative thoughts about how things are going. That is certainly a hallmark of PTSD. Avoidance. So, you know, of course, fear is very normative, and we want to make sure that things are safe. But if you're finding yourself avoiding a number of situations, so if you're not leaving the house, or if you have a hard time leaving your loved one alone, even when they, you know, are telling you that they're okay or they're going to be okay, or avoiding going to places that reminds you of the traumatic experience, or avoiding talking about it, that would qualify for avoidance. And of course, if you find yourself jumpy, easily startled, sort of having a physiological fear response when, you know, maybe the phone rings, for example, and you have a big fear response, then that might be an indicator of PTSD. Doesn't necessarily meet diagnostic criteria. I would encourage people, if you think, you know, if you're experiencing those 4 things and you're thinking, oh, maybe, you know, maybe it might be PTSD, I would encourage you to, you know, look for maybe a professional or somebody who might be able to give you a proper diagnosis and help and treatment plan it.
Lucy, how important is it that, you know, when people are experiencing, I mean, I'm just thinking about working with carers, and so often in the midst of the crisis, the last person that they seek support for is themselves. But how important is it to get that early emotional processing, and in order to sort of head off PTSD?
Yeah, so I think it's not only is it hard for family members to get that help, but also it's rarely are the family members being asked how they are doing. You know, we just had an experience here recently with a very significant suicide attempt, and for us, in what we do, we naturally looked at the parents and said, oh my goodness, how are you doing? And they were shocked, because it was, you know, they were like, ah, nobody's ever asked this before. And so paying attention to your own suffering and your own reactions is extremely important. And the earlier you can do that, obviously the better. So, you know, without emotion processing, it's really difficult to not then develop a trauma response. Not necessarily might be PTSD, but it might be certainly a trauma response. And so emotion processing, it involves taking some time to talk about it, taking some time to make sense of what happened, allowing thoughts and images This is, part of that opposite action thing. So, an image might come into your mind and you're like, I don't want to think about it. I just want to push it out of my mind. But allowing that image to be there, yes, it's painful. Yes, it's really hard, and it's not dangerous, right? You might react when you have a memory of what happened as if it's happening again, as if it's dangerous again. But having a memory or thinking about it, it's safe. Like, notice around you, I'm perfectly safe. I'm just thinking about this. It's painful. It's very painful, but it's safe. And so allowing yourself to talk about it and think about it as often as it comes to you is really important, because I think what happens is that then people don't want to think about it, don't want to talk about it because it's very painful, and oftentimes don't have the opportunity to think and talk about it because they're so involved in what their loved one might need. So they fail to have any proper emotion processing that then goes on to, stick around.
Yeah, and that self-invalidation of my pain is nothing compared to, my
Right.
loved one who wants to eliminate themselves, and that's such a self-invalidation. I might, because we're in the last 5 minutes and my watch is actually running slow, so we're probably in the last minutes. Terry Lee, do you want to talk about what supports are available to people in Victoria and what carers should look out for in any state?
Sure, I'll throw over to Liz as well for the carers perspective, because I kind of want to acknowledge that I'm a mental health clinician, a DBT therapist, so I'm kind of come from the clinical perspective. But in Victoria, of course, we have our family connections groups, and so I would encourage anyone, if you've not been able to access a family connections group, to stay tuned and keep watching for those on the NEA BPD Australia website. And we're looking at some online programs soon, so that should help with people who can't get to a program nearby. But in Victoria specifically, we do have carer consultants and carer peer workers in public mental health services. So if you are interacting with the public system in Victoria, it may be a way of getting some support from people other than mental health clinicians, mental health practitioners, particularly if you feel that you haven't been supported. Victoria sort of made efforts to get more carer peer workers and carer consultants on board, which is fabulous. And a wonderful initiative in Victoria is a program called FATME, Families Where Parents Have Mental Illness, for young people who are carers and perhaps have a parent with mental health issues as well, and they have particular needs. So you can look out for your local FATME program. That's now in all area mental health services, but they offer support to people outside of mental health. We've also got the Tandem Mental Health Carer Network in Victoria, which is great, a peer network for people who have a loved one with mental health issues. And you don't have to be involved in public mental health to access that. It sits separately. And also, if you are involved in our Centre of Excellence, which is Spectrum in Victoria, Spectrum has a carer consultant as well. So you can always try and access that person if you are interacting with Spectrum. And you can also jump on the NEA BPD Australia website, where we'll try and put information there of how to get extra support. But I might throw over to Liz as well, just for the South Australian and the carer perspective. She's our expert on that.
Hang on, Liz, sorry, you're not unmuted. Let me unmute you.
Yep, sorry. A lot of the things that Terry Lee mentioned are duplicated in South Australia in one form or another, but specifically, and I've just posted the website to it, we have a Sanctuary BPD Carer Support Group, which has about 300 members, holding monthly meetings, but you don't need to come to meetings to register and be on the distribution list and get information. That is the main pathway for carers in South Australia to receive up-to-date information about what's available for carers of people with BPD. We've also just had open BPD Collaborative, which is a specialised BPD service in South Australia. It's a public service. It's only in baby stages, really. It's going to take a couple of years to develop fully. But if you look up on the SA Health website and you look up BPD Collaborative, you will see information about that. They're the main two places I would recommend people go in South Australia. Yep.
Thank you. And same thing in Western Australia as well. There are a number of agencies that specialise in looking after carers. There's Carers WA, there's Helping Minds, and there is Mental Illness Fellowship of WA MIFWA, and they're all free. And two of those three run family connections groups, and we have independent family connections groups running as well. And the BPD Foundation, which is another mostly volunteer-based organisation, on their website they have a state-by-state list of services that is pretty much up to date already. The other thing that I would say is, you know, I know that there's been some comments in the chat, and we may not get to them all before we get through, but just to acknowledge, you know, that caring for someone with BPD is a really tough gig, and that, you know, there can be some very traumatic things happen, and you know, demand help until you find a clinician. You know, just as traumatic looking for help can be as well, because it can be very invalidating. Please, you know, just continue to reach out until you find someone who gets it, because there are increasingly more people out there who get it and who want to help. So I think, the only other thing was, did anyone, Kylie or Mary, did you have some more that you wanted, anything more that we needed to add? Oh.
I think Mary was going to talk about, oh, here she is.
I've unmuted you, Mary, but I can't hear you. No, it's still really quiet.
Oh yeah.
Speak louder. Can you hear me now?
Yes, just.
Just letting everybody know that we have an annual conference on the 31st of January, and that's the National Education Alliance for Borderline Personality Disorder. There's international and national speakers coming. It will be held in at Origin in Victoria, and we'll also have Family Connections leader training with our international trainers from Ireland, Professor Daniel Flynn and Dr. Mary Kells, and they'll be holding it at 3 sites. The training will be on the 1st and 2nd of February following the conference in Victoria. It will then go to Queensland on the 4th and 5th of February, and then on the 10th and 11th of February in New South Wales. If you'd like to just get in touch with me, you can forward an email just to check those dates. It's neabpd@neabpdaustralia.onmicrosoft.com.
Okay. So I think we're pretty much on time, which is amazing. Lucy, just again, thank you so very, very much for your time tonight. It's really fantastic to see that not only that there are sort of carer aware clinicians out there changing the world of treatment, but by doing the research, it means that that there's an evidence base, and that research is going to get shared around the world, and that you're going to really make a huge difference for a lot of people. So I think I speak for a lot of carers and people who support carers when I say that it's really fantastic research, and we're really grateful that you shared it with us.
That's great. And I was just taking a second to scroll through some of the chats, and I see people asking about very, very traumatic experiences with their loved ones. So I hope this was at least a little bit of, shedding some light into what your experience might be, and that people will look for some help beyond what we are able to do in this hour, and to really seek some of these resources that you guys shared. So thank you all for having me, and thank you everybody for watching.
Okay, well, I'm going to turn the recording off now.
Okay.
Pause, stop recording. We're done.